Hello, friends. Happy New Year. I hope that you are doing very well and that you are enjoying the beginning of 2025. I can't quite believe it's 2025. I think with everything that's happened in the last few years, the turn from 2020, it feels like years are missing. Time has just flown past, and somehow we are hurtling towards 2030, a period when we were promised cybernetics, some kind of cyberpunk reality, Blade Runner reality, where we would have hover cars in dark, murky corporate run worlds. And it feels like in some ways the darkness is there, but the cool stuff that comes with it hasn't quite made it yet. But nonetheless, I'm optimistic, at least in terms of things in my own life, in our little communities here. And I think that there is a lot of energy and momentum at the moment. There is discord, of course, disruption, but actually it is through the clash and conflicts of things that new things are born. And today we're going to be talking about one of the most important kind of conflicts, revolts, possibly revolutionary moments in English history, and I would argue by extension in world history. This is seen by many socialists and communists as one of the first major socialist movements in world history. It could also be argued that this is the beginning of libertarian ideals in English history. It is also a proto-Protestant movement, so very much heralding the onset of the Protestant Reformation, which would take place a couple of hundred years later. But and also it's probably the first populist movement, at least in the medieval world. It is the most significant in an English context, and so I think it has interest just as a really dynamic moment in medieval history, which for many of us, the way it was taught to you is same for me, we see it as a very static society with a feudal, almost caste system, a dark age where science and technology was held back. And it's only with the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment that there is progress and line going up. Now, many have dispelled this notion that the medieval era was a backwater. Actually, many of the great things that we take for granted, not just the architecture of the beautiful cathedrals, but many of the customs, laws, traditions of our peoples, such as Christmastide, which we are on the 12th night of, belong to that period. But more than that, this event shows that it was actually a rather explosive, exciting time to be alive, despite all of the hardships. And in fact, that there was a real vibrancy in the English people. And also it gives us something to reflect upon in our own time. I can see many parallels with the causes and of the Peasants' Revolt and how it was mobilized and why it failed with potential populist movements today. And maybe we'll touch on some of those as we go through. I will leave many of them for you to work out, dear viewer. I trust your intelligence on that, and rather than telling you what to think, I will just provide the Peasants' Revolt and you can draw your own insights and conclusions. Maybe in the discussion afterwards, we can talk more fully about it. But there's one question I want to put in your minds before we get to the heart of this, before I start outlining the events which took place, the factors involved. And it is this, well, it's two things. So the name Peasants' Revolt did not belong in that period itself. It's a later ascription from many hundred years later. And I want you first to think about, what does the word peasant mean for you? How do you think about it? What sort of person comes into your mind when you think of the word peasant? And secondly, how does that word, that concept, impact your conception of what the revolt was? And of course, some of you may already know what the Peasants' Revolt involved, but even so, how does this impact the way you think about it? And I'll give folks a chance to put any comments in the chats related to that. How is this influencing you? Because I think many of us have been taught to have a sort of view of a peasant which we see in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. There's a point where King Arthur, on his search for the Holy Grail, passes by a commune of peasants who are rolling and digging in the mud. They are the poorest of the poor. They have a meager, awful life. They're throwing out the dead following the Black Plague, and it's a grim reality that no one would want to go back to. And when you think about this, then you think of the Peasants' Revolt. It's an uprising of the mass unwashed who seek nothing but to destroy, to overturn the social order, who are a threat to all good things. This is the sort of notions that many of us might come away with. And certainly there's some element of this within the revolt itself. But I think that we need to see that first and foremost, peasant is not an economic category per se, in terms of how much wealth a person has, but rather a standing or a relationship to other castes or other categories within the great chain of being. The conventional wisdom of the medieval era was that God had created a hierarchy amongst all things, with God at the top, and everything would be on an ascending scale. And within the category of human, which is above all other creatures on Earth, there was a hierarchy within that. You would have monarchs at the top who are divinely appointed by God to that role, descending to noblemen, maybe to freemen, and then your serfs near the bottom. And in the peasant category, which would include serfs, but wasn't totally dominated by that, there were certain restrictions. For the serf, that meant, in a sense, they were the property of their lord. They were restricted in what they could do. They had to work certain days on the lord's land for the lord. They had to gain the lord's permission to travel for more than one day out of the lord's land. They could not take work elsewhere. And when they died, their most valuable possession would go to the lord, maybe a cow or something like this. So they are tied to their lord and to the lord's land. So it's more a sense of, okay, you're an inferior being who belongs to another above you in the social hierarchy, in the metaphysical hierarchy, I should say, and thus you must be treated in a certain way. Now, this holds well until the aftermath of the Black Death. In 1348, in England, the Black Death, the bubonic plague hits, and this has a devastating effect. The population prior to the Black Death was around 6 million people, which in today's world seems a tiny amount, but actually in England, that was the population. After the Black Death, it is 3 million, roughly. So it's halved. And this is the case across Europe. I remember reading that if you wanted to look at how devastating the Black Death was, you would have to have the combined casualties of the First and Second World Wars times by 20 or something like that. It truly wiped out a huge section of society and thus shrunk the population in a dramatic fashion. For those who survived this awful suffering, which must have been terrifying, seeing families and friends decimated by this awful illness, whole communities wiped out, villages disappearing. For those who survived, there was a positive outcome, because the death of so many peasants led to labour shortages. There were less peasants able to do the work of farming and tilling the land and so on. And as a consequence, the value of that labour increased. The peasant was more highly sought after by the landowner than he had been before. Before, if you weren't going to do the work, another peasant could be taken to do that work. Whereas now, you're all that's left. So you can start to demand higher wages. You may even seek to go to another lord or another landowner who's going to pay you more than your current one. And so you can already see the fragmentation of the peasant class because you're able to negotiate your wages and you may be able to travel to somewhere else. And indeed, many peasants start to be able to accrue a lot of wealth and buy up land. So much so that perhaps they're starting to rival the landowners who are paying more than they used to. Indeed, some of the peasantry are starting to dress in clothes which are deemed to be belonging to the higher estates, such as wearing pointy shoes, the classic medieval pointy shoe. And so, to kind of counteract these measures, the gentry classes are pushing the government to do something about this. So in 1351, we get the Statute of Labourers, which essentially attempts to fix the wages that a peasant can demand to pre-Black Death levels. So fixing the wages somebody can get. Moreover, there's certain limitations now being enforced on the ability to travel, to take up employment. It's actually illegal to move without your law's permission to do work elsewhere. And although this doesn't get enforced, there is an attempt to constrain what fashion can be worn by the peasantry too. So there is a lot of resentment against these attempts to shut down the mobility of the peasantry, at least on an economic level here. And this provides a backdrop to many of the developments which take place closer to the peasants' revolts. This is the general atmosphere of antipathy towards the higher levels of the great chain of being from peasantry. And I hope, though, this gets across that when we're talking about peasants, then it's not necessarily like the poorest who are going after this. It's not the vagabonds and the beggars. It's guys who are acquiring wealth, who are accumulating land and property and power in their local areas and are being held back by government statutes, by those who are deemed higher than them in the hierarchy. And these are the ones who are, your craftsmen, your so, for example, some of the people involved will be bakers, tailors, and so on. People with skills who have influence in their local communities who are going to be leading this revolt. There are maybe two kind of further things here that are interwoven at this point. The first is the foreign context. England at this point is in the 100 Years' War. And while Edward III had made great strides in his early reign in France, almost conquering about half of it at one point, towards the end of his reign, most of those victories have been lost, and he is only holding Calais and I think one other part of it. And so this is the kind of situation in 1377 when he dies. Now his son, the Black Prince, had also died, and so the throne passed to his grandson, Richard II, who at this point was still a boy, which is a bit of a disastrous situation. It means that you don't have a strong authority figure on the throne and that you are relying upon his advisors. And his advisors, well, many of them are the other sons of Edward III. Figures like John of Gaunt, John born in Ghent, who is a widely despised figure within England. He is the richest figure within the land. He's accumulated a lot of wealth to himself. He keeps trying to raise money to attempt to gain a throne in Spain. And he is involved with importing a lot of foreign merchants into London, which I'll get to in due course. And he he is connected to several failures within the Hundred Years' War, as is Thomas Woodstock, who in another of the brothers, who in 1380 attempts to lead an expedition across to France, disastrously fails. And so there is this sense that the taxes that are being collected by the Richard's government is being spent by incompetent individuals who are seeking their own glory abroad, whilst also stuffing their pockets. And so people are not getting bang for their buck. Think of something like the war in Afghanistan, or the occupation of Afghanistan, where there are English, Scottish, Irish, Welsh lads dying for a war which we're spending money on and not seeing many results. Situations like that, or maybe international aid might be another example of this, where people feel angry at the spending of millions of pounds in situations where it doesn't seem like it's doing any work. Meanwhile, the people overseeing it in the government are lining their pockets and so on. This is the sort of characters we're getting here. And to raise money for the 100 Years' War, the wars with France, which are going very badly, Woodstock's expedition failed. The fleet at one point is shipwrecked off Cornwall, so it's not going well at all. They start to implement poll taxes, so flat levies upon the population. And in 1377, they implement the first one. 4 pence everybody has to pay. This is widely kind of submitted to, and it raises a significant amount. But they then think, okay, this works well, maybe we'll do it again. So in 1379, you get another poll tax. This time it is graded, so not everybody's paying the same. There are 15 classifications which people fit into. And this doesn't raise as much, but there's still a degree of compliance. But by 1380, so this is the same year that Woodstock's expedition fails, there is another poll tax brought in to fund the wars with France, which, before I talk about the poll tax, I should say the war with France was a serious security issue. Whilst Edward III had achieved victories on the continent, had brought France to a certain domination and then had lost those, and while there wasn't necessarily an immediate threat from France invading, there were points where the French were attacking Southampton, for example. So, or at least the fleet was seen off Southampton. So I think there was a genuine notion that the French, being only across the Channel, could attack England. This wasn't just a war far away. This was a rival who, for many centuries, had been a problem for the English. Not least because, if you think about through Scotland, there had been many French attacks as well over the years, and would continue to be in the future. So this isn't a ridiculous notion that the French are going to attack. Actually, they are England's primary enemy from the 1300s onwards, and there was a real possibility that they might land troops on England at various points, or at least fund troops from neighbouring countries like Scotland to attack. So they implement a third poll tax in 1380, demanding 12 pence from everybody in the country. They do say that the rich, the lords and so on, can cover this cost for others if they so wish, but that's like asking Jeff Bezos to cover the taxes of the Americans who can't pay their tax or something like that. It's not going to happen, right? So you would need a Victorian philanthropist, I suppose, to maybe get away with that. And so there is not a lot of compliance. A lot of people disappear from the register. They claim that they cannot pay it, or they've already paid too much, and it brings in a meager amount. And so the regime, the government, start sending out special commissioners to make sure that the tax is collected. And these will be teams of people who will go to various villages and towns, register everyone in the town, and ensure that unless they are children under the age of 14 or they are vagabonds, that they pay their 12 pence. And so the commissioners go out to the various towns, and it is in the southeast of England that the action starts to take place due to these fellows. Now, there is one. Which order to do this in? The two main places are Essex and Kent. This is where the Peasants' Revolt has its origins. It is going to be the people from these areas, and it is the confrontations with various commissioners which kicks things off. One of these commissioners in Kent was a fellow called John Legg. He was a sergeant at arms, so he belonged to the royal household, and he was notorious for being a very hard hitter and very invasive in a way that was deeply shocking and disrespectful, a violation. What he used to do is he would take the girls, the women, and if he was unsure if they were old enough to pay, he would examine down below. He would examine their private parts and determine whether they were of age or not. There are accusations that another fellow by the name of John Bampton, who was working in Essex, did the same thing. So this isn't just asking people or finding evidence. They're violating the daughters of these communities. And so this seems to have reached a head because in the 30th of May in Brentwood, there was a commission led by Bampton and Guildsborough, who was the Speaker of the House of Commons, to Brentwood. Now, Brentwood was a village in Essex, and the sources I've seen, there's a little bit of disagreement of what happens. Either the Bampton and co. summoned the representatives from local villages to account for the missing money and to kind of make a statement, you're going to pay, or these fellows knew Bampton was going to go there, and so they brought a large number of representatives from the local villages to confront them. Either way, they are there, and one fellow called Thomas Baker stands up and he says, "We're not going to pay this. We've already paid our poll tax and we've got the receipts to prove it." Bampton, totally misjudging the situation, calls for the arrest of Thomas Baker and almost 100 other individuals. Now, to put this in context, he only has a small guard with him. This isn't going to happen. A fracas breaks out, and Bampton and his guards have to flee to the local abbey. This is the beginning of what's going to happen. In the 2nd of June, I should say as well, at this point, things have kind of gone over an edge here, because it's one thing to speak up against a commissioner, but these men are representatives of the king, and so to physically attack Bampton and his guards is to essentially lay a hand on a representative of the king, which is treated as attacking the king. It is a treasonous offence. And so all of these individuals who are involved now, such as Thomas Baker, are guilty or could be accused and found guilty of treason, and thus can be executed for their crime. And so it's not good enough to just apologize and say this was a mistake. If they're going to, if they do that, eventually they'll all be rounded up and they'll be killed. And so really the situation leaves them with no choice but to go fully in on this and try to raise the support of other peasants to their cause, because there'll be safety in numbers. There might be a sense that if they are able to bring enough pressure on the system, they might get their way and they might get away with this. At least that might be one way of thinking about this situation. or at least some of the motivation. So on the 2nd of June, so a few days later, there is a great meeting at Bocking in Essex. And this seems to have brought a number of groups together within the Essex area. And there, those involved in the revolt swear an oath. Now, an oath isn't just a promise. It's not just a set of words that you hope to uphold and maybe will and maybe won't, and it doesn't have significant consequences if you don't. An oath for a medieval person is spoken before God, and to some extent you might see it as legally binding. It has like the force of contract, but more than that, it's a matter of honor before one's God, before one's family, before one's community. To break an oath is one of the most disgusting things a person do. You would be reviled for it, and you have betrayed your Lord in heaven. This is a sinful, wicked thing. It's the sort of thing that like Judas Iscariot would do. Yeah, that's how you've got to see it. So the words that they're saying here are weighty, that they're committing to. And what do they say? Well, they're going to kill the lieges of the king, diverse lieges of the king, that is, those advisors who have misled the boy Richard II into committing these taxes. And they are not going to approve of any law which they have not ordered. Now, just think about that. They are basically saying that the laws of the land should accord with the will of this group, of the peasantry, of the people. This is a populist message that's going on here. This is a radical commitment to make in medieval England, in any period prior to the 17th century, probably before the English Civil War. And even then, in the English Civil War context, it was a radical departure from the norm. This would have upended the whole system of government in England and challenged the very notion of the great chain of being, the hierarchy which governed medieval society. So at the same time that this is happening in Essex, there is also events taking place in Kent. And we know that around the same dates, there was an attack on Rochester Castle, where several prisoners who had been arrested connected to the poll tax were being kept. The attackers, the revolters who managed to do this, managed to get in when they kidnapped the constable of the castle's children and forced him to surrender. They then moved on to Canterbury, where they managed to detain the Sheriff of Kent and forced him to open up or hand over the records of Kent, the tax records, the registers of who's who, and they put them all on a big bonfire. Now, this is quite a significant thing and will characterize much of the violence committed by the peasants. They're not just burning everything down and killing anybody that they can. Rather, it is very targeted what they approach. So in terms of burning records, what's that about? Well, if you're going to enforce feudal law and enforce your peasants to stay on your land, well, if you have proof that they are your serf or your peasant in a written document, you can enforce that by the law. It's much harder to do it through oral tradition. It can be contested. Likewise, if you're trying to raise money through a poll tax, having a register of who's who in a district is vital for that. If you can burn those documents, well, that person can maybe claim they've paid the tax, or they don't belong to a certain area, or whatnot. So by destroying these documents, by burning them, they are eliminating the administration, which allows for the control of the peasantry. And the other thing, and they do this repeatedly, so they do this in Canterbury. When they get to London, they will also do this in various buildings. They also attack particular individuals and the property of particular individuals. So Take, for example, Guildsborough, who was in Brentwood with Bampton. They attack several of his houses. Richard Hales, who is the treasurer, the royal treasurer, and the head of the Knights Hospitaller in England, he is associated with this tax, so they start attacking the properties of the Knights Hospitaller. Likewise, Simon Sudbury, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, he is the Lord Chancellor of England. And so the attack on Canterbury is not just an attack on the administration, but on him. And so you can see that they are specifically targeting the lieges of the king who they deem responsible for these acts. It's not just anybody. It's not mindless violence. Now, in the case of Canterbury, it seems like the peasants here, those who are rebelling, are being marshalled by an individual who is particularly associated with the Peasants' Revolt, and his name is Wat Tyler. We know nothing about Wat Tyler prior to 1381. His name may suggest that he was a Tyler. Many people's surnames are indicative of their trade, and the records conflict on whether he was from Essex or Kent. It has been suggested that perhaps the fact that he has two locations may indicate that he has broken the rule about working somewhere outside of your lord's domain. So maybe that's part of his rebellion here. But whatever the case, he quickly becomes the captain and leader of the Kentish movement here. And he oversees a declaration, a peasant's declaration. And they promise to abolish serfdom, to establish the right to work for whoever you want, wherever you want, for whatever wages you can command. So this is a complete overturn of the current working conditions. It's almost a freedom of movement, a freedom of employment, and a removal of the fixed wages from the 1351 Statute of Labourers. And the other thing they demand is that the property of the church is seized and redistributed around the country. So it's not just opposition to the secular government agencies and landowners, but also to the churches, which in this time, the ecclesiastical hierarchy and institutions, the monasteries, the abbeys, can also demand taxes and collect rent because they own a lot of the land. So they are being seen as another target for this revolt, which is understandable when you think both of the relationship of a peasant to a landowner, whether that's a secular one or an ecclesiastic, but also Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is the Lord Chancellor. So the two are intertwined. The higher ranks in the hierarchy are bound up with the church's domination of the peasantry as well. And it may also point to a theological kind of strand which is coming into this, a theological radicalism which has entered into the Peasants' Revolt. It's not just a rejection of the poll tax, and indeed, if you think about the demands that are made by Wat Tyler's Kentish revolters, there's no mention of the poll tax. It's not part of their manifesto, so to speak. It is more fundamental changes to the working lives and the economic condition of the English peasantry. And it's been suggested that this may be the work of a man called John Ball. Should I introduce John Ball right now? Yes, I will go for it. Let me say as well, if anybody has any comments or questions, please put them in the chat and I will get to them in due course. But John Ball, he seems to have been a priest in the Church of England, or the medieval Church of England, I should say, and he was trained in York, or was a minister in York for some time before moving gradually to Colchester. But in 1375, he was excommunicated by the Bishop of London, who at that time was Simon Sudbury, for, well, two things really. First, for being a vagabond preacher. That means he's roaming. He's not just staying in a fixed location. He is traveling from church to church, parish to parish, and preaching his message, which, according to Sudbury, is heretical. It is against the teachings of the true apostolic church. And so this man Ball has been excommunicated. And prior to the revolt in 1381, Sudbury issued a warrant or a command that Ball be arrested and locked up in a prison, indicating that in Sudbury's mind, Ball was an agitator, somebody who could stoke up tensions against the poll tax. Now, in the 12th of June, there was a great assembly of peasants, of the revolters in Blackheath. Now, this would have been, Blackheath was outside of London at this point, and there's some estimates that say 200,000 people were at this place. That may be an over-exaggeration, but we're talking tens of thousands. Just a huge amount of people. Now, how did they all get there? Well, it seems like that there was a network already established in Kent, in Essex, which would have allowed for the circulation of information very quickly. There were probably a core group of the revolt on horseback who would be traveling from village to village, town to town, and as they made their way towards London, rallying peasants to their cause, who then may either follow them directly or join them at Blackheath later on. They were also sending messages to each other, coded messages to one another, and in writing. And I have an example, a paraphrase or a translation of one here. So John Shep, sometimes I think it's stayed in York, now in Colchester, greeteth well John Nameless, John Miller, John Carter, and biddeth Piers Plowman to go to his work and chastise Hob the robber. Now, what does this mean? Well, nobody knows for sure, and there are a lot of competing suggestions as to what it means. But I think there are some clear things we can pick up from this. So, John Shep. So this is a gospel reference, a New Testament reference to John the shepherd. So a priestly figure, an ecclesiastic of some authority, sometimes stationed at York, now in Colchester. Well, that sounds like John Ball, right? He greeteth well John Nameless. So is this an everyman? So greeting everyone. John Miller and John Carter. Well, these are specific peasant class activities, craftsmen, tradesmen. Biddeth Piers Plowman to see to his work. Now, Piers Plowman, there was in this era a narrative poem released between 1370 and 1386 called Piers Plowman. So I think 86 is far too late a date. Or at least, if it's not this poem, something called Piers Plowman, an idea, a character, or whatever, was already in the people's minds by this point, given this reference. Piers Plowman is an allegorical poem which focuses on a narrator trying to pursue a true Christian life in a medieval Catholic world, and is incidentally one of the first references to Robin Hood in balladry. And at this point, Robin Hood is not the figure we've come to know him as, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, but the name Robin Hood was often associated with criminals, those living outside of the law, those maybe poaching or hunting on land which is not their own. So they're violating the norms of the period. They are maybe taking what is wrongfully prohibited to them. by these upper groups. At least somebody like John Ball might say that. So a reference to Piers Plowman may have included this idea of those who are seeking to live a true Christian life as opposed to the false one that the current order established by the corrupt church, the government which is imposing these taxes, may be in violation of certain rules like Robin Hood, calling on them to chastise Hob the robber. Now, there are two versions of this that are taken. One might be that Hob the robber is a nickname for Robert Hales, and so go to his place, go to his property and attack it, burn it, destroy it, kill him. Alternatively, it could be a command about chastising those who try to rob during these attacks. Because, as we will see, the revolt was very harsh on thieves. They actually killed and executed people who attempted to loot the buildings they were burning. And it's been suggested this might be because the revolt is trying to make a principled point. They are trying to present themselves as the agents of light, the true Christians, restoring England to a Christian future rather than looking for personal gain. So it could mean either of these things, but it shows that there is to have a coded message like this, you need people who can read. Well, the peasantry, many of the sons were going to abbeys and monasteries for an education. Many would become monks, but others would go into their trade, so they would be literate. They would have to understand the references here, so they must have had these conversations. There must have been these ideas and codes in the parlance at the time. Probably suggests that these ideas were already circulating and that there may have been a radical network amongst the peasantry in these areas who were almost waiting or ready to or take advantage of a situation like this emerging. And additionally, in this area, we find that there are soldiers from the 100 Years' War who join the peasants as well. This was an area where there was easy recruitment to take people across to France, right? Because it's just across the English Channel. So it's natural that there would be a lot of individuals of that nature, especially as this was an affluent, populous area due to its wool trade. So I think this then gives the peasantry a bit of military experience. It's growing in numbers in this revolt, and they are highly organized and mobilized. There's a minority, perhaps this network, combining written communication with a group on horses going from town to town, rallying a large number of people. So it's not just a spontaneous burst. And it may even be the case if we think about the earlier confrontation at Brentwood with Thomas Baker and the other representatives, that there was a degree of organization in that. There was a minority who were dictating the terms and mobilizing a mass movement. It wasn't just individuals popping up without any direction. And this is true of all organization, of all movements, of all things, of all situations involving human beings. People cannot act as one without some minority taking the lead, whether that's an individual or a group of people who are controlling the means of communication, who are providing a kind of framework for understanding situations and a call to action which people can follow. So they marshal, let's say, for argument's sake, 200,000 people at Blackheath, and the chronicler Thomas Walsingham reports that John Ball delivered a sermon, a very radical sermon. And let me read this to you. Let me also show you a picture of this heretical priest, if I can find. There we go. Here is John Ball misleading these peasants, which, as you can see, they are very finely dressed. These are not men in rags wallowing in the mud. No, we have armed peasants in fine doublets and fancy, very fancy hats. So let's see what Mr. Ball had to say. In very famous lines, he declared, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? From beginning, all men by nature were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. For if God would have had any bondman from the beginning, he would have appointed who should be bond and who free. And therefore I exhort you to consider that now the time is come, appointed to us by God, in which ye may, if ye will, cast off the yoke of bondage and recover liberty." He would go on in Walsingham's description to claim that they must first cast down the great lords, then the justices of the peace, the MPs and the bureaucrats, and finally anyone who would disturb the liberties of the Englishman in any village. And by casting down, he means kill. Now, the problem with Walsingham's account is that John Ball was definitely not at Blackheath, at least if the dates add up, because on the 11th of June, he is released from prison. He is broken out of prison, but this takes place on the 12th. And given he would have been in a village several miles away from Blackheath, he wouldn't have been able to make it in time using medieval modes of transport. So it's unlikely that he delivered this sermon there. So we might wonder, is Walsingham trying to present Ball in the most radical terms possible, and thus castigate the peasants' revolt as a unholy movement seeking to overthrow the established order set down by God, to be the most crazed, fanatical, demonic threat to medieval society, and so really chill his readers in the process? Is it an entertaining thing? Is it a thing which is meant to reinforce the resistance against any place for more concessions to the peasantry, perhaps? Another thought might be, okay, in medieval history, it's quite common to collide events together to give an impression of something. So, okay, maybe Ball wasn't at Blackheath, but is this the kind of thing that he was preaching around Kent and Essex? Is this the kinds of ideas he's spreading in this network of radicals? Quite possibly. I mean, it would provide the theological justification for their demands for the end of serfdom, for example, because in their minds, if originally God had created all men equal, then no one has a divine right to rule over another. No one has the right to demand labor from another, to demand that they stay on your land. These are impositions of a later character, a perversion, a corruption, a degradation, a yoke which is placed on the free man. And so it is a radical kind of egalitarianism, theologically grounded in the creation, the true order of God for John Ball, and thus gives the rebels a divine right for what they're doing. I think that's, and so while he may not have been there, this might have been the ideas, theological ideas percolating. I think it's possible, if not likely, that something like that's the case. Whether it would have been put in this specific way, I'm unsure, but the line, "When Adam delved and even span, who was then the gentleman," that's the sort of thing that as a kind of line of propaganda could be repeated in a non-literate society mainly, although there were some who could read, many couldn't, so you could spread your message through a saying like that. We see in the Reformation, the Protestant movement, the Lutheran movement in Germany, would use little rhymes and phrases and songs to help spread the message. So this could definitely be that kind of thing. So I think that might be a genuine reflection of what John Ball was spreading and what the Peasants' Revolt is being motivated by, which may also then tie into this rejection of looting by them. So we have this great event at Blackheath, and then there is a bit of a standoff because William, is it William Waltham? Let's see. Yes, William Walworth, who's the mayor of London, demands that, well, orders the guard, or orders his men, the guard of London, to guard London Bridge. And this is the only bridge across the Thames in London at this point. And so the throng of peasants have no way, apart from boats, which I think would have been possible, but you kind of need London Bridge really for that number of people. They cannot get across the Thames. So what they do is on the south bank, the men from Essex start attacking various prisons, such as Southwark, releasing the inmates out of these prisons. They also go after Lambeth Palace, which was again the Archbishop of Canterbury's place. It still is. They burn the records. They go into the wine cellar and they start drinking the Archbishop's wine. And one monk across the river in Westminster Hall, so the very seats of power, hears the rebels crying, "A rebel! A rebel!" This was an exciting, ecstatic event, the ecstasy of destruction. Think of the January the 6th guys who broke into the Capitol building. Nothing like what happened here in terms of the violence. But there was, the guys were on a high. They were enjoying it, being in there. And that's what these rebels would have been feeling as they traversed the seats of power, these kind of sacred places which it was unthinkable to go into. Now they were trashing the place. And those of people that they really hated, who had imposed vicious taxes upon them. So there is a standoff, and Richard II and his advisors, such as Simon Sudbury and Richard Hales, are hiding in the Tower of London. Tower of London is a very strong, defensible area. It's going to be really hard to, well, almost impossible to take the Tower of London if it is well guarded. And so they decide, this is the safest place to be. It would have had more defenses than it currently does. On the perimeter. So it wasn't just a prison, it was a stronghold. And so they're deciding what they're going to do. And so they decide that they're going to put Richard II on his barge and take him down to meet the rebels towards London Bridge. At least a few of the rebels, the leaders of the rebels. And I will show you another picture here that we have from a manuscript of Jean Froissart, a French medieval historian. Here we go. So you can see that Richard, here he is. He's looking a bit older than 14 here, I must confess. But he is on his royal barge and he is here to meet the peasants. And what's important here is to understand that Richard was told, and his advisors, that there was only going to be a few peasant leaders to negotiate with. No, they bring the whole lot of them. Now, Richard seems to have been keen to still negotiate. This is actually for him a moment of realization that he is a certain authority that others don't, because he's being told by an intermediary for the peasants that they have no ill will against him, that they are royalists, that they do not want to overthrow him. So he has a kind of bond with the peasants that the others don't. It's a very deep thing that they would just not cross. Everything else they will challenge in the order, but the right of the king is never questioned. So, and also he is a young man. There's this idea that his advisors have kind of manipulated him. Think of Wormtongue and Theoden as maybe an example of this in The Lord of the Rings, where the wicked advisor Wormtongue poisons the mind of the aged king, and thus he does deeds against the interests of the people. So there's this idea that Sudbury, that John of Gaunt, that Richard Hales are misleading Richard II, the good king, who has really got our interests at heart. But his advisors say, no, this is a bad idea. We're not going to let the king negotiate with 200,000 peasants. So they leave, and this angers the peasants quite considerably. They are infuriated by what they see as a betrayal of the situation. They've been promised a negotiation, and so they march on London Bridge, which, despite the orders of William Walworth, opens its gates. We can see London Bridge in the background here, and you can see peasants walking through it, and a little bit of fighting going on here. Can we, if we zoom in? Yes, there's a little bit of fighting, but this man, he's not putting up any resistance. This guard of London Bridge, he is conceding the ground, and that's what happens. Maybe they were sympathetic to the plight of the peasants. Perhaps the guard was also concerned that if London Bridge was attacked, it would be destroyed, which would damage the economy of London and the wealth of England more broadly. And so they move across and they start attacking various establishments. They attack the Priory, which is the head of the Knights Hospitaller, the centre in England, which, as you'll remember, Richard Hales, the Lord Treasurer, is the head of the Knights Hospitaller in England. So this is an attack on him, as it were, and his property. The records are burnt. They go after the Savoy Palace, which was the domain of John of Gaunt, and this place was, it was fit for kings. When various royalty were captured in the wars with France, they were held hostage there. This is luxurious beyond belief, and the peasants burn it to the ground. There's not a brick left, and they destroy all of the records in there, and they execute a man for trying to thieve from it. The property they find inside, they either burn, or if it's gold or silver, they throw in the Thames. They're very much saying, we're not doing this for personal gain. So when a man tries to steal a trinket, he is thrown in the River Thames and drowns. A story circulates as well that there are 30 of these involved in the riot go into the Savoy Palace's wine cellar, start drinking, and as they do so, the burning building collapses in on them. They become trapped in the wine cellar and die 7 days later. So there is this very strong anti-thief idea going on here. And Richard, at this point, he's returned back to the Tower of London and must have been seeing the fires spreading across London at this point. He may have also heard of some of the deaths or the violence against people taking place. There was a man called Sir Richard Lyons, who was a merchant, a half English, half Flemish merchant in London, and his house was attacked, and he was executed or killed by the rioters. Now, this attack wasn't random. John of Gaunt had been giving licenses for Flemish and Italian merchants to operate within the city of London. And this was a great challenge to the monopolies of the English merchants who worked within the city. Some of the wealthiest men in the country, definitely not direct allies of the peasants' revolt. But it seems like that the peasants were maybe directed against these merchants. Perhaps there was a sense that they were indicative of John of Gaunt's mismanagement, his corruption, his wickedness, and so they were a target while he was not available to be attacked. There may have also been a sense as well that many of these men in Essex and Kent were tradesmen working on the Thames, and that their opportunities were being curbed by the laws against the peasants, while meanwhile we've got foreign tradesmen reaping the benefits of England, the wool trade, the connections with the continent. And there may have been then a resentment against them for that reason. Nonetheless, he is killed. And so on the 14th of June, Wat Tyler and Richard II, along with the advisors and the peasants, have a negotiation. And Richard agrees to, by oath, to several things. He promises to abolish serfdom. He essentially agrees to overturn many of the regulations, the things which are preventing the peasants from working freely. And although he doesn't explicitly say this, it seems like he kind of gives permission to the peasants to kill many of the, or to deal with the traitors amongst his ranks, let's put it that way. So let me stop this one. And can we get another picture of these lads talking with the king? So no, I'll need to show that a little bit later. Oh no, this might work. So we can see the king. This is Wat Tyler here, and he's talking to the peasantry. We'll come on to what's going on here in a sec. But so Richard then goes off somewhere. We're not sure where. But the peasants then march on the Tower of London, now unguarded because the king is withdrawn. And they kill and execute 5 individuals. The primary ones are Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, Richard Hales, who is the Lord Treasurer, John Legge, who's one of the commissioners, who's, if you remember, he was investigating whether the girls were of age by sticking his fingers down into their vaginas. We have a lawyer and the physician of John of Gaunt, given he is not there himself. They are executed, they're beheaded, their heads are put on spikes and placed on the Tower of on the London Bridge, where rebels' heads are usually kept. So it's almost like the peasants are now acting as if they are the executors of the king's will, delivering the king's justice in his absence. And if you think back to Piers Plowman, the reference to Robin Hood, well, although in this period it's not fully worked out in time, there'll be this idea that Robin Hood, in the absence of King Richard I, was delivering his justice. He was defending the rights of those who had lost their land and property and lives to a tyrannous King John or Prince John. So Robin Hood is kind of standing in the place of the king, delivering justice for the people of the king's land. So too, these peasants are doing the same. They also attack 150 foreign merchants, killing them, and 35 Flemish individuals who are hiding in a church are massacred by them. Now, at the same time, many of the peasants, they think they've got the deal done with the king and disperse. But it seems like a core remain who are engaged in this violent activity, led by Wat Tyler. And so on the 15th of June, there was another negotiation. The king needs to gain control of the city. He can't do that by force, at least not previously, because there is no standing army. There is no police force. The main army is in France, fighting the French. They are outnumbered by these peasants. But with many of them dispersing, the situation changes a little bit on the 15th of June. At Smithfield, there is another negotiation with Wat Tyler, and this is, or Smithfield, I should say. And this is the negotiation at Smithfield that we can see here. We have the king, King Richard, dashing King Richard II, talking with Wat Tyler. And Tyler's demands have gone further. He's now asking for an abolishment of all laws to do with poaching. So at this time, there was laws about who could poach on a lord's land or a king's land. Essentially, peasants were forbidden. This was seen as stealing property. So if you killed the king's swans or the king's deer, this was punishable by death. This is one of the many things which Robin Hood does, and many of the people who are the inspirations by Robin Hood are associated with the thieves in the forests, you see. That there would be an abolition of manorial courts, so feudal lords could not enforce their feudal responsibilities on peasants. And this is probably the most radical suggestion, and perhaps points towards the influence of John Ball, the abolition of the hierarchy of the church, that there would only be one person in charge of the church, the Pope, that the monasteries would only have enough money so that they could survive, and everything else would be equalized. Now, this is probably more than the temporal economic changes that are being demanded. Those are radical enough, right? They're challenging the metaphysical hierarchy of being, but the order of the church, it was taught that this had been established by Christ and his apostles. So this is questioning the notions very central to medieval Catholicism, that the bishops, the priests, and the monastics were pursuing a divinely ordered plan for the church, and that these were the agents who convey the message and means of salvation, i.e. the sacraments. If you're kind of collapsing the hierarchy, you're really leading to questions about, in time, of salvation, who has control over the word of God, the Bible, and so on. And if we think that at this time we have a figure called John Wycliffe, who seems to have had an impact during this period. He is teaching, let me see if I can find a good summary here. So he is teaching, for example, he's in Oxford. He's ironically being supported by John of Gaunt, but he's teaching things like the supremacy of scripture over tradition. So that it's not what the papal ecclesiastical authorities say, which is necessarily true. It is, we have to test it by, does it conform with the Bible? And to this regard, he taught that the Bible should be translated into vernacular languages available to laymen. It's not a notable theme in his works, but it is there. So again, there is this idea of an egalitarianism with the scriptures. So I think then there's also other things that he was suggesting. So he rejected transubstantiation, which is the idea that in the Mass, the bread and wine would transform into the body and blood of Christ. So this is seen as the central act within the medieval church. It's the heart of the rituals of the church. It is the center point which all of the activity is focused on. It is the thing which everyone in the community does to affirm their membership once a year. But he's saying that isn't the heart of, that isn't true. And so it is not the primary means of salvation. In fact, it's more like closer to Luther's idea of justification by faith. So these ideas are percolating. John Ball may be carrying some of them around with him. So when this might be the motivation for what Tyler's kind of demand here, it's not coming out of nowhere because it seems unconnected from the rest. It may also, though, just be that the church has a lot of property, a lot of land, and thus is imposing taxes and responsibilities upon the peasantry. So it could be that as well, breaking the power of the church. Nonetheless, it seems that Richard agrees to these terms, just like he did before. And then Wat Tyler asks for a drink of water, he asks for a drink of ale, and then one of Richard's retinue shouts at Wat Tyler and calls him a traitor. Wat Tyler is very angry at this and starts to fight with this individual, and William Walworth, who we can see, let me get this. There's a little bit of a, if I can zoom in. William Walworth here intervenes. Wat Tyler draws his dagger and swipes at William Walworth and misses. Walworth catches Wat Tyler on the shoulder, and he starts bleeding profusely. He then starts riding back to the peasants, slumped over in his horse, and the peasants begin to notch their arrows. At which Richard, who has kind of taken the initiative and rides forth to the peasants. Here he is talking, addressing the peasants directly, and he says, "You will have no captain but me," and demands that they follow him. And so Richard starts to lead the peasants across the fields. He takes them many, on a fair journey, and they're following him. They believe he's their guy. He's going to give them what they need. But eventually, he leads them to a certain place where levies from London have been raised. Over the previous days, it seems like William Walworth and others were working to raise the levy in London, to organise men who can help them to take down the peasants' revolt. And so they're waiting for the peasants, the diminished number of peasants at this point, who have lost their initial leader in Wat Tyler. The king leads them there, and they essentially have to surrender. And the peasants are escorted both back to Kent and Essex. And this leads to the end of the peasants' revolt. In due course, many of the peasant leaders are executed and killed. Wat Tyler himself, while the peasants have all run off after the king, he is dragged out of hospital where his friends have taken him, and he is executed on Smithfield with no court, no judiciary or anything like that. So the peasants' revolt ends badly for Wat Tyler. It ends badly for many of the peasants. Richard later is confronted by peasants, I forget if it was from Kent or Essex, demanding that he upholds what he had promised. And he essentially says, "You're not only not going to get what you demanded, but you're going to have what you already have, much harsher and stricter." There were some positive results. There was no poll tax implemented in England until Margaret Thatcher, so 600 years later. Serfdom in the next 50 years is abolished in England. And there becomes this sense, I think, that in general, that you cannot push the lower classes too far, that there becomes a certain point where you will unleash a beast. And so you have to be careful in how you engage with the lower classes, or how far you tax, how far you impose, how far you put demeaning demands upon them. Now, again, I want to encourage you, if you have any questions or comments, now's the time to put them in the chat, because I'm going to start wrapping up soon. I want to talk a little bit about why it failed. And this is more an analysis. This isn't just describing the events that took place. I think, as I've already said, that an organized minority has to lead a group, any group. If you think of a club, a chess club, there will be somebody who organizes the meetings of the chess club, who rents the space, who buys enough chessboards to do it. They may organize an end-of-term Christmas party. There'll be those people, a president, a treasurer, a secretary. That's quite common in a lot of societies and clubs. You could think of any others. Even a small society will probably have a committee who are overseeing its affairs, who are organizing the activities of that group. And the peasants had that. They had a network, potentially led by Wat Tyler, influenced by John Ball and others, who were directing the activities, who were dictating its behaviours, who were shaping its demands of King Richard. There was two major weaknesses, it seems, or three. The first is with the execution of Wat Tyler, the peasants seemed rudderless. They just totally conceded the ground to King Richard and allowed him to be their leader. There didn't seem to be any infrastructure or possible replacements. There was too much emphasis upon Tyler himself as the leader of the group. His removal led to the end of its direction. The second thing connected to this idea is that the peasants were too loyal to King Richard. All throughout, they kept making this pledge that they were not trying to overthrow the king, that they didn't want to challenge his royal authority. Indeed, for many of them, the thing that they were looking for was, rather than renting land from a landowner, that they would, an intermediary, a noble, a baronial lord, etc., they would be getting it direct from the king. Now, that relationship then, and they also saw the king as an ally who had been misled and who would genuinely have their interests at heart. And to some degree, they may not have been wrong. Richard seems to have enjoyed kind of building a relationship with the peasants, of seeing himself as the one who could negotiate with them rather than his advisors. And indeed, he seems to have tacitly allowed them to kill off some of his advisors, thus distancing himself from the poll tax and the kind of regulations that had been put in place before him and by others. But the main problem here is that if you're trying to overthrow a hierarchy, a system, they weren't just trying to be one regime replacing another. It wasn't just like the King of France trying to become the King of England, slotting in to the systems which already exist, which was most of the warfare or most of the revolts in the period. This was an attempt to overthrow the very essence of English society without overthrowing its foundation, its cornerstone, which was the monarchy. If you're not overthrowing the high point, the thing which all things flow from in the great chain of being in England, then you can't overthrow the whole thing. And indeed, what you're doing is you're trying to overthrow the system whilst relying on a core pillar of the system itself to do that. And so by doing so, they weren't able to sweep away the very systems they sought to overturn, because they still trusted in one part of it. But thirdly, and maybe tied to this, is, okay, maybe they could have got away with that if they had a genuine counter-elite in their corner. By counter-elite, I mean, the regime itself, the government with Richard and his advisors, is an elite who are the ruling elite of the English. Now, outside of the ruling elite, there may be other elites, nobles, for example, who would have the requisite authority, power, and wealth, and perhaps legitimacy to challenge the rule of the country. Take, for example, later in Richard's reign, Henry Bolingbroke would lead a revolt which would overthrow Richard II and lead to him becoming Henry IV. He was a counter-elite. Now, if the peasants had had Henry in their corner, perhaps they would have had a leader who was capable of replacing the current regime, the current ruling elite, and implementing the demands of the peasants. Perhaps. But they didn't have somebody like that on their side. They had nobody who could meaningfully take executive power in England. Wat Tyler was never going to be the king and never going to be part of the ruling elite. He could demand things from the ruling elite. He could bring the pressure of his numbers to bear, the violence he could inflict, but he was never, in a meaningful sense, a counter-elite. And so without that, there could not be a change of government, a change of who was in charge, which would be, I think, would have been necessary for the implementation of the rebels' demands. But perhaps even more than these things, so these three things, the seeming focus on Wat Tyler as the leader, the trust in the king, and the failure to gain a counter-elite, maybe the fourth thing is that their demands were against the principles of power in the first place. Why would an elite or a counter-elite support a movement which seeks to abolish their power over people? And indeed, would it ever be workable to have such a system in place where the peasants could dictate terms as to what should happen in their country? There is no root. Actually, the very principles, the egalitarianism of it, militates against a organized minority, at least in principle, governing things. But without such an organized minority, everything would just fall apart. So not only is it not in their interests of the elite or the counter-elite, it's also just impractical. What they're demanding was just not a possibility. I think that the fate of the Soviet Union kind of shows this, insofar as whether or not, regardless of the characters of the men involved, the socialism of it was supposed to move to a communist utopia where men would live freely and equally with one another in communes, in equality. But instead, you get this highly authoritarian structure where the communist revolutionaries become a new elite, organizing and dictating the way life should be lived in Russia and the broader Soviet Union. Even, communist revolutionaries couldn't achieve an equal society. Perhaps they never wanted to, but I think that in itself is a pointer against the populist kind of demand for rule by the people. There always has to be an elite. So I think there's at least these four things count against them. It's the failure of them to develop their own elite, which could rival the elite that was already in charge, and thus bring to bear their ideas, but also that their ideas militate against the very basic principles of governance. But nonetheless, it is a very interesting period and something to think about for us, as we are in a time of constant seeming battle between populists and elites, populists and kind of bureaucratic institutions, populism, the will of the people or groups of people, against experts who seem to be without legitimacy, kind of John of Gaunt's and Simon Sudbury's in our own age, and the emergence of a counter-elite, figures like Elon Musk and so on, trying to harness this populism, the increasing kind of likelihood of political violence. We're already seeing it in 2025. In 2024, we saw the Southport riots. January the 6th would be an example. The left wing have been involved in a lot of political violence, such as through Antifa and Black Lives Matters. We shall see what develops in the future. But we're certainly in a period where it looks like many of these kind of dynamics are in play. And the question is it going to be similar to the Peasants' Revolt? Or is it going to have lasting change? And I think, there's questions of whether a populist revolt could ever bring lasting change. It doesn't seem to have particularly worked in the ways that we think of. Maybe something like the English Civil War could be seen as closer to it, but that involves elite groups fighting counter-elite groups. the parliamentarians. Cromwell is no peasant or vagabond. He's a man who's of the gentry. He's a commander in battle. He's an MP. He's somebody who's part of the power structures, who is harnessing a lot of theological and popular dissent to the Caroline government. But it's different from a Wat Tyler in that respect. It's a properly organized group who in the end don't implement the most radical suggestions of groups like the Levellers and the Diggers, who might be the equivalent of a Wat Tyler and John Bull, but do go quite far in executing the king. And you can see there, they execute the king in due course. That leads to a paradigm shift. It's a big change compared to what the Peasants' Revolt was able to achieve, because in part they still want the king. So that's a kind of overview of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, an explosive dynamite event in English history, which had significant kind of inspiration for later events. Perhaps indicates something about the Anglo as well. Maybe this is something I want to mention too, is that the Anglo spirit, it seems like as far back as this, in the 1300s, the late 14th century, there are movements towards libertarian thought, insofar as what's being demanded is a freedom of the individual to work, of where they live, of being able to negotiate their own prices. It's a breaking down of monopolies. It's a breaking down on restrictions and regulations, and a demand to allow for the ambitious and aspiring groups in Kent and Essex to be able to achieve what they can. It's a certain, you can see a kind of classical liberal ideology emerging there, premised on an egalitarianism and of the equality of man in the original creation, and that everything else is an unfair, illegitimate imposition. Now, it's not as fully worked out as later thought, which would say, if one consents, then it's okay. But that idea is kind of there in the notion that the peasants would have a say in what the only say in what laws would be passed or not. So it's a consensual basis. It's also perhaps an early kind of proto-socialism. There is ideas of kind of redistribution of wealth, certainly of the churches. There's a sense that all men are equal in terms of dignity, rank, and power, apart from the king, who is himself kind of beholden to implementing the will of the people. And that this is a movement not just for the wealthy, but for all the peasants in England. So is there in the English psyche, in the Anglo spirit, always something of this egalitarian dynamic, which would break forth more fully in the 17th century, which would underpin the classical liberalism of John Locke and the American founding fathers, which may have been critical to the kind of Christian philanthropism of the British Empire, the notions that slavery was an evil because all men are created equal under God, that the British Empire would not only abolish slavery, but actually actively fight against the slave trade and spill English blood in defense to overcome slavery. Are these ideas, there's a reason why these ideas emerge in Northern Europe, Northwest Europe, and in part in England, rather than in other places in the world. And maybe there's something in the Volkgeist, the folk spirit, the psychology the community cultures of the English. Maybe it goes back to Anglo-Saxon times. That certainly in the 17th century, they would argue that Anglo-Saxon society, under the laws of Alfred, was free, that all men were treated equally before the law, and that due to the Normans' invasion, there was a yoke, there was an imposition of unfair laws placed upon the English, and that the parliamentarians were trying to overthrow these laws. That Charles, who was in a position established by the Normans, was upholding. So, does that logic follow? I'm not sure, but you can certainly see these narratives emerge. So that's maybe something to think about as well, that maybe there is something like this in the Anglo spirit, which maybe works amongst Anglo peoples. The American Constitution essentially assumes an Anglo-Christian peoples who have similar values and expectations of excellence and a high trust between one another for the American government to function. It assumes that culture and ethnos. Does it work in a multicultural one? Well, does it work in one that's been so corrupted since the 1930s? I don't know. But it's something to think about. Right. I'm going to... let's see. I think... Are comments working on this? Because it does seem like... oh, yes, there are comments. I can't see the comments. I cannot see the comments at the moment. That is the problem here. That's okay. I'm going to have to go into the YouTube video. I'm sorry, friends. I have not seen your comments so far. Let me. Is there another way to do this? I am sorry about this. I am not. I am a peasant when it comes to technology. The Norman masters at YouTube have befuddled me. Why won't it let me start? Apparently, I'm not going to be able to see these. Right, I'm going to go to the YouTube chat and see what everyone's been saying. Hello, friends. Hello, Tricky Woo, Gondorian North American Unionist, Tricky Woo again, Dawn Browning. Thank you very much for the perfect shirt. It's actually my Jacobite shirt, but I thought that was very much in the spirit of this, despite being a royalist movement. It seems like the sort of thing a peasant might have worn. Vingle, good to see you, my friend. Let's see. JG Padfa. Don't know what that means, but it's a good name. I see these are all comments made during the stream, so I'm unsure what's in response to what. But hello, Ragplay. It's good to see you. They're trying to avoid the idea that they're attacking the king. Yes, this is a common trope in revolts, that you say you're not attacking the king, you're attacking his advisors, that he's being misled. And this is a way of avoiding the charge of treason. The period I studied at university, the Covenanters, the Scottish kind of revolt against Charles I for the imposition of the prayer book, the Anglican prayer book. They claim they were not attacking the king, but rather were upholding the king's realm by upholding the true religion. And actually, they would defend the king against his enemies. So this is definitely a move people make. It's often not very convincing, and the king generally doesn't buy it. Although Richard seems to have offered full pardons, for example, to the peasants, so he's not against them in the way that Charles Charles definitely was, but against the Covenanters. But I think I do think as well there does seem to have been a deep loyalty to the king, and the only thing I can connect to it is when Queen Elizabeth II died. Many Englishmen were moved in a very deep and profound way by that event. And it wasn't any particular personal affection for the Queen. Yes, she had ruled a long time, and maybe that was part of it, the end of an era, the end of something permanent in our lives. But it felt more than that. It felt like this is a loss that my ancestors would have felt. This is something I'm connected to through my blood, through my land. Something which is so deep in my soul that when this happened, I just have to weep. It's a bond, it's a loyalty, it's a pledge that goes beyond voluntary affirmation. And indeed, the whole idea of monarchy is that we are, well, in part, is this notion that our lives are not just what we choose. We're actually born into a given situation. We're given things by the world, by God, by the transcendent. And this includes certain hierarchies, certain ties to people in a hierarchy. Yes, I think that's also part of this, that your peasant feels this to a certain degree, and it's why it's unconscionable to threaten the king. I mean, even for Cromwell and co, they didn't just go straight to execution. That was only decided after Charles, under house arrest, had essentially plotted or conspired with the Scots to break him out of prison so that he could rule once more. They didn't want to execute him. That was like beyond the pale. And when Elizabeth I of England had Mary Queen of Scots executed, it was a scandal across Europe. You don't do that to monarchs. It's just the undone thing. Let's see. Lothar Sheffield, hello sir. If it wasn't for the Black Death, radical depopulation, perhaps the revolt may have never occurred. Supply-demand economics. Possibly. I mean, I talked about the Black Death earlier and how it did lead to tensions because due to depopulation, the peasantry are becoming economically mobile and giving ideas of freedom that are then being curbed by the elites. I think that provides a context, but then you have these poll taxes within a very unpopular regime, which is failing on the domestic and foreign front. And but the spark is the invasive commissioners who, investigating whether the girls are of age by looking down their trousers. This is like the sort of stuff is going to really anger people. Think of current things in the current moment. What's angering people? What's getting people fired up? It's that kind of thing. Now, if you don't have the Black Death context, does that lead to revolt? It's impossible to say. It certainly leads to a heightened situation and more animosity. But I don't know if that would be enough without it. I mean, the argument against it is we live in an age where things have been done which are far worse than that, and people are not revolting. So maybe if we had lived in a Black Death context, post-Black Death world, maybe we'd be more likely to revolt. Although we do live in a post-COVID world, so I don't know. But yes, I think that's fair. Mm-hmm. Oh yes, I can see Dawn Browning saying that I skimmed over the Black Death. Yes, that's right. Tyler went for Rag Plays. My good friend Rag Plays. I'm glad to see you, sir. Tyler went full commie, and had his demands been met, would have seriously thrown the whole medieval frame of being into jeopardy. Yes, it would have. It really would have been very radical. Now, again, we really only have the reports from the counter side, so it's difficult to know for sure if these were his true demands. But if anything close to them was the case, such as the abolition of serfdom, the right to work for anyone and for anybody in any place for wages you could negotiate, that would upturn the whole medieval hierarchy. It would lead to the death of the stratification, probably in time the death of the monarchy. The whole medieval world would have been thrown into disorder and probably chaos, let's be honest, because as soon as you kind of go on this radical egalitarian route, well, who's going to maintain the orderly business of things? And surely, okay, you're going to overthrow the main means of governing the country. Well, it's not going to be this perfect paradise where everybody gets along in the commune and leaves the peasants alone. No, you're going to have robber barons. You're going to have guys who try to take power in their own local areas. You may even get the French coming in to conquer because now England's undefended. Nobody's paying for the army. So there's a degree of kind of utopianism here, which is just totally unrealistic, especially given the fact that you're dealing with fallen men. Surely these guys who live in medieval Augustinian Christian Europe should have been the first to recognize the fallenness of man and the reality that many would have just abused the situation. I mean, England had a period of anarchy in the 1100s, and it was a time of civil war where, under Stephen and Henry, soon to be Henry II. Was it Henry II? I think it was Henry II. Let me double check. Yes, Henry II. England was plunged into, in many places, a lack of governance. And what did you have but thieves and barons kind of tyrannizing their own people? I think Wat Tyler was an idealist who didn't really take into consideration the true darkness of human nature. But then again, he's tempering that by allowing a place for the king. So perhaps, and perhaps he would have still had a place for the state. And I suppose he may have been drunk on his own success. Who'd have thought the peasants would have been that successful to have got to London, to basically taken the capital and kind of push the king to commit to various things already? Of course he's going to push his luck. Of course he's going to take it further and see what wild fantasies he could get. Of course, again, this kind of shows two things. One is that you give a guy an inch, he'll take a mile. Richard II concedes to Wat Tyler's original demands, and then Wat Tyler demands even more things which are even more outrageous. But secondly, the old adage, which seems to be that you agree to the revolt's terms, and then in a month or two you go and kill all the conspirators who have accepted what you're doing. And I think that's why I was trying to get across that one of the problems here is a revolt like this implicitly still wants the system, the regime. It's just saying, no, the regime needs to act in a certain way, rather than replacing the regime to implement their own ideas. That seems to be a major flaw in this populist revolt, and many populist revolts, which are really just people complaining and using force to bring to bear their complaints without saying we need to displace the actual governing power here, because they're just going to keep doing what they do and will eventually come at us. Lots of good points here. I'm just scrolling through. Probably lasting trauma in the mind of in the Saxon mind from the Norman conquest. I think that's probably. I think there's something to that, and I think that there's definitely a strand of thought within English history which sees a lot of the problems going back to the Normans and a decisive turning point in English fortunes from the Norman conquest. This is quite a complex question because I think, although with the Anglo-Saxons you do see the emergence of an English nation under an English king, under Alfred and then Athelstan. And then this is conquered by a French-speaking elite who are ethnically different. By the reign of Henry II, there's a real attempt to forge through a unity of these two things, an English identity, which sees the two as together into one reality. And so when we talk about Englishness, our language is inflected with both Anglo-Saxon and French words. Our customs, our institutions are heavily influenced by the Anglo-Saxon and the Norman. And so much so they become synthesized into one. And so I see this as an ethnogenesis of the English identity and ethnic cultural matrix, whatever you want to call it. Though there is still an ethnic division insofar as a lot of aristocrats have Norman blood. And you can see this in a figure like Boris Johnson, for example, whereas a lot of working class people probably lack Norman blood. So there is still that aspect to it. But I think it's easy to castigate the Norman without realizing it is actually a part of who we are now and formed what it meant to be English in a strong way. You have to excise a part of what it means to be English to kind of deal with that. But then, that's part of this, right? That's still part of the dynamic that's going on here. Oh, hello, Dawn Browning, very kind, has sent 20, I think that's Australian dollars. Thank you very much. Thanks for this, Nathan. You have some good opinions on the subject to boot. Well, I'm going to like that very much, and thank you. I very much, I appreciate your donation. That is very kind of you, very, very kind. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I will try to answer them. Richard Phillips, your explanation of failure felt very elite theory. Yes, it is a very elite theory. I'm applying elite theory to the Peasants' Revolt, and I think I tried not to kind of go into all the detail about elite theory, but yes, I'm taking that lens. I think I've not seen anybody use that lens to analyze it, but I think it's a very effective explanation of why it failed, that its leadership was not strong enough, that it relied on the leadership of the regime it was opposing, and that its very ideals were against leadership. This seems like a great, why is it? And maybe this is a problem with all populist revolts. At least if you had maybe the thing which is stronger now is you do start to have counter elites emerging who may be leading them, but they themselves are part of a system which is always never going to be responsive to the will of a people. It's got to manage the behavior of people, right? So it can't be wholly responsive to that. But anything which is closer to that might be a bonus. Caravaggio, loyalty to the crown, loyalty to the man or woman. Yes, I think that's right. I think that's a good way to characterize the Englishman's bond with the monarchy. Current moment, indeed prescient. Yes, I think so, Low for Sheffield. That's partly what motivated me to do this, because I had planned on doing this stream a long time ago, but I just things got in the way and I kind of lost momentum. But with everything that's been going on, I felt just taking a step back and looking at a popular revolt, probably the greatest populist movement in terms of size and significance in English history, was a worthwhile thing to do, and lessons for us as well in the current moment. Dawning browning. I'm getting tired. I'm going to have to finish soon. One of my ancestors was a death warrant signatory. Family rumor is that he was hunted down by a quad to Belgium and killed. His wife and 4 children returned to England. However, this is disputed. That is very interesting. By a squad to Belgium and killed. That is very exciting family history. I like to believe that is true. Oh, a quad is in a group of 4 blokes with sword eatings. Interesting. That sounds like a little story can be written for that. Let's see. Rag plays. Henry V seemed to really exemplify that union, at least according to Shakespeare's ideas. As Englishmen all. Yes, I think that's right. By the time of Henry V, you're no longer talking about Saxons and Normans. Henry V, of course, is a play written by a Tudor, William Shakespeare. So at least by the Tudor time, we can say, based on that play, that they're not really talking about Saxons and Normans in a real sense. And really, the debates in the Stuart period about Saxons and Normans come to the fore in like historical settings. They're then taken up by popular movements like the Levellers. But it's not like your average bloke is saying, "Oh, I'm an Anglo-Saxon." They're not really saying that. Rather, they're saying the English people are descended from the Anglo-Saxons, and the Normans have imposed this. And the Stuarts, who are Scots, remember, they are seen as foreigners by many of the English. And the Stuart house itself claims its descent from Brittany, or the Bretons, which come across with the Normans. So this is an easy way to tie the King Charles to an ancient kind of oppression of the English. But I agree with you. I think the Peasants' Revolt has no mention of Anglo-Saxon or Norman, as far as I'm aware. So there's an Englishness now, which is a kind of agreed upon. Maybe even in like the time of Edward I. That's maybe there. I do think like the Arthurian mythos with Geoffrey of Monmouth. So Geoffrey of Monmouth writes the history of the kings of Britain in 1136, 1138, something like that. And that establishes like the Norman conquest, in his view, as a kind of restoration of British rule, because he presents like the Britons, some of them have emigrated let me rephrase this. The Saxons are invaders of the Celtic Romano-Britons. Arthur is a Romano-Briton who kind of pushes out the Saxons and goes conquering Europe, and his knights establish houses in Brittany, in Normandy. And so the sons of these knights are the people in kind of Geoffrey's mythological, possibly truthful histories. The Normans are the descendants of like Arthur's warriors, and so they're restoring Britain actually, rather than overturning it. And so you could see like that kind of thing as establishing a Normanness as inherently British, maybe English. Black Norman propaganda, yes, indeed. So I think there's. I mean, I'd need to look more into this, and that could be an interesting discussion too. But certainly, this idea of English identity does emerge. Kind of intriguingly, the Arthurian cycle stuff kind of dies around the late 1300s. It's quite big in the 1200s. You get like the Grail cycles and so on. But there is a poem that comes around this time, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or Gawain and the Green Knight, which is one of the greatest Arthurian epics. And it's kind of it's interesting. It's the one thing I regret about my King Arthur Day, which I did last year, which was a great success, and I really enjoyed it and loved it. It's one of the best things I've ever done, and I'm so proud of the fact that there's so many great people in this sphere who contributed to that day. But I didn't get to myself talk about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's one of my favorite poems. But and it deals with kind of challenges of courtly love and convention and what it means to be the perfect knight. But it is quite kind of subtly critical of Arthur's court, insofar as Gawain, who's the youngest, is the one who steps up to the challenge. And Arthur himself is kind of seen as a bit of a sham. His court is more concerned with feasting and drinking than it is really virtue. And Gawain's like the only one who really upholds the virtuous life. And he feels guilty when he cannot do this perfectly. And so there may be in that even a criticism of this kind of hierarchy, that actually, the true hierarchy is founded in virtue, not in clothes or riches or even inherited status. This, if you want to kind of push this further, this kind of critique gets a really forceful expression in the writings of Thomas Carlyle in the 19th century, who developed this notion of hero worship. This is the idea that men and women are drawn to adore and worship certain individuals. Worship might be the wrong word, but to love individuals, to follow them, to admire them, to pledge their life on individuals, not on principles, not on ideas, but on people. At some kind of gut level, we are drawn to, and we will follow through thick and thin. Individuals who shape history around them. There's a kind of vortex around them that bends the world to their design. And this might be for an evil intent, but for the true hero, it is to bring kind of the eternal laws of justice to bear. Somebody like Mike from Imperium Press might call this character an Odinic leader or hero, somebody who destroys the old order and brings in the new. From destruction, brings new life. And then following such a person might be a person who rules by tradition, who cements the achievements of the heroic individual. And this would be a Tyrrhic leader, a maintainer, rather than a creator-destroyer. Now, for Carlyle, then, the person that we follow, it's not based on their status, wealth, or rank. It doesn't matter, what kind of standing they have in civil society. That is an outward appearance. What really matters is in here, their sincerity, their heroic drive, their absolute devotion to a higher cause. They become the kind of incarnation of that. In a way, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is kind of pushing in that direction with its subtle satire of the court of Arthur and praising Gawain. He gets the praise alone. And there does seem to be a trend towards that over the next few hundred years. That's a bit of a kind of leap I'm making there, but I think it's fair. I think you could show that. Even in kind of religion with the Protestant Reformation, there's a move away from external work to the internal, what one feels, one's faith. And that is the thing which justifies, not how many indulgences you've bought, how many prayers you've made, how holy you appear, one might say. That would be the Protestant kind of critique. So yes, I think like these ideas are kind of getting emerging in this period, and the Peasants' Revolt and Sir Gawain, whilst miles apart, seem to share some of this. Let's see. So loaf of Sheffield for £2 for beer. Don't tell Padver. Again, I do not know what Padver means, and I don't know why he will object to the beer. But thank you very much, loaf of Sheffield. That is very kind of you. And I will tell you, I was in Sheffield not that long ago. I enjoyed the place. It was it has a lot of beautiful post-industrial or industrial architecture. I was really impressed with the town hall, and I found a few good places to have some pints. So I appreciate that very much, and very grateful for your donation. What is Fingal saying? Tolkien's translation of Sir Gawain is excellent. Yes, I think it is. It was a great one, and I liked his essay on it too. He has an interesting take, which is worthy of consideration, about the morality of Sir Gawain and his kind of focus on courtly custom and convention, and actually Gawain follows it too far, perhaps. Worth a read. You can find it online. Probably the 100 Years' Wars played their part in all this. Yeah, I agree with that, Rag Plays. I think that's probably a big factor. Just as, like, you can't underestimate the impact of the First and Second World War upon us, even though we only really think about it at Remembrance Days now. I think the kind of absolute decimation of a whole generation of men and the effects of kind of the Blitz and so on, that's going to change a people. And no doubt the 100 Years' War in its own way, and the Black Death. I'm going to add the Black Death into that. We've only really spoke about his economic benefits, but if your town is wiped out, that's going to change the kind of person you are. And maybe some of these people who were involved in this, they'd seen the very worst. They weren't going to put up with it anymore. They'd gone too far. They'd survived something awful. Yes, I agree with you, Vingle. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is one that you return to again and again. It is really great. Yeah. Oh, and thank you, Vingle, for mentioning my subscribers. I've reached 3,333. Or 3,330. Yes, it's great, and I'm really glad to have all of you guys watching. It means a lot, and I enjoy the conversation we have. It's always stimulating, and yeah, I would like to stream more regularly, but with my current life, it's not possible. But it's great to do it when I can. And as you may have seen as well, I've recently started doing videos for the Corncrake magazine, which, if you don't know what that is, the Corncrake magazine is it's a relatively new. I think it's been going about a year now. It publishes stories from English literature, both classic and by current authors. And by current authors, I mean guys in our sphere who are trying to make stories which are just good stories and kind of engage with our tradition rather than just trying to subvert it and destroy it. It's got some really good stuff in there, and occasionally I might write some stories too, but I do some videos for that now as well. So you can, I'll be doing it, I think, about 3 a month for that. So check out those if you get the chance. But otherwise, I do not know when I'll be next back. Hopefully sooner rather than later. I'll give everyone just a minute or two in case there's any final comments. Let me spell it for you. Dawn Browning. Oh yes, Fingal's already there. And hello, Stephen Bollich. Um, I apologize for your pronouncing your name, mispronouncing it, but I hope that you enjoy Sigawain. It is excellent. It is truly excellent. Is there any final questions or things that Rag plays? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Is there anything you would like me to stream on next? Any particular topics? Put them in the comments below if you haven't got a chance to put them in the chat. I'm very interested in the history of castles at the moment, which are fascinating, and medieval culture in general. I feel like part of me would really love to go and do more research in that, like on an academic level, but I've done enough academic research for a lifetime. I need to go and work. I need to to fulfill my peasant duties and pay tax and all this kind of thing. Unless there's a peasants' revolt, maybe we can organize one. Do the Crusades at some point. Yes, I mean, I love the Knights Templar and the history of them, so maybe I'll do some of that. Some of that came into Arthur Day as well. Is there a word limit for Corncrake Mag submissions? And can a Norwegian submit? I believe you can submit as a Norwegian Ringle, but the focus would still need to be on like Anglo literature, so it has to be written in English. It would. Could it be on Norway? I suppose it could be. You would maybe need to talk to the editor. The word limit, I think, is 5,000 words. Though some stories, might be split over a couple of magazines. So, go for it. Go for it. I hope you do it. Do I know much about St. Chad? I don't know very much at all, I'm afraid, Dawn. I will note him down. St. Chad and the Crusades. He's obviously got a great name. Absolute Chad. I hope, though, for Sheffield that goes well. I did not know that you do heritage buildings as part of your work. That sounds pretty cool. That sounds pretty awesome. Compare ancient Egyptian castle technology with high Middle Ages. That sounds interesting. I mean, I'm also interested in the death of the castle. I've suddenly become very interested in cannons. Cannons are now my new favorite piece of technology, and the formation of bastions and kind of star forts and that kind of stuff. Because it's kind of a very striking thing. I'd never really thought about it, but of course, you think the cannon led to the end of the castle, but you're talking about a form of architecture and defensive fortification which had dominated Europe for hundreds of years, suddenly becomes pretty obsolete in a short space of time, and people stop building castles, except for as like a romantic holiday house, or a country estate. Nobody's building them for defensive purposes, and they're being totally replaced. It's quite interesting. It's very interesting, and how then that changes the nature of community life, which was such an integral part. The castle was an integral part of that. That just disappears with new technology. And so new centers, new defensive ways have to be emerged. And of course, this changes again with World War One. You see trench warfare, but by World War Two, trench warfare is kind of out the window. Bingo, I haven't traveled there, but I've seen so many castles in Italy online, and I mean that makes sense. We often forget, or at least I forget, that Italy and Germany, they are really new countries. They did not exist until the 1800s as one unit, really. At least from the medieval period, these were all distinct cities, distinct regions with their own political powers in a way that somewhere like England or France does not have. And so you're going to need a lot more castles to protect these smaller realms, which are more, there's more borders to protect. So I think that's it's quite startling when you think about that. My neck of the woods is the English-Scottish border, and we have a lot of castles up here, precisely because that is on a frontier, which was changing hands so often. I think, so where I live, changed hands at least 13 times between the English and the Scottish within the space of a couple of hundred years. That must have been pretty crazy for the inhabitants. Imagine the changes in all the regulations and laws, and of course, when the English were in charge, the English citizens got a much better deal than the Scottish ones. When the Scottish were in charge, it was the other way around. It's quite interesting. No castles in Norway, hey? Or very few. Well, that's an interesting point. Maybe nobody wanted to conquer Norway, or maybe nobody could, or maybe the Norwegians are too busy conquering everyone else. Although I read a great passage about the Vikings recently. I am quite tempted to read it to you to trigger all the Scandinavians in the audience. Should I do it? Press 1 if you think I should read this passage. Press 2 if you don't think I should. Whilst you answer that, yes, Jason, you're right. Bombasts could blast through castle walls, and the Starfort does replace it. So that is quite an interesting shift. And Starforts, you could have a town in a Starfort, whereas a castle can't really have a town, so they become a much bigger fortification. Jason, that is a huge question. I have thoughts. They need to be more developed. Maybe that'll be something for another day. But it is a very good question. I'm quite tempted to do a stream on the collapse of Roman Britain. So it could come into there as well, that question. I have weighed it up in the past, so maybe I'll do that. It seems like, well, we've got 3 who want to hear this. Vingle is unsure. I'm going to go and get this book. Give me a second. I'm going to let me play a little clip from Terry Jones while I go and find this book. Terry Jones, I've already mentioned him. He's one of the Monty Python crew, but he has a very good point about the medieval era. So give me a minute and a half and I'll be back.
And you said the only snag is that the entire population of medieval London is going to be killed or injured on the roads every year. That's the only trouble. There's going to be 30 or 40,000 people. You'd think twice about living in this day and age.
Well, that's true. That is true. But I mean, the sanitation and all, you've grown used to loos and cleanliness. And I mean, you have all your own teeth, I can see. But I mean, it was a bit...
Except this one, somebody else on there, yeah.
You're breaking it in for somebody else. Yeah. It was a bit squalid, though, wasn't it?
Well, I think it was probably less squalid than we imagine. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be all shiny plastic surfaces and things like that. But I think that people had to live, and they did have concepts of health. I think we have a very kind of... I think we were brought up to believe in progress, and this idea that we're living on this this increasing line where everything's getting better and better all the time. And I don't think things are, really. I mean, you just take something like medicine.
You're a reactionary, aren't you, really?
I am, yes, you're right, Harry, I am.
Marching backwards, that's the way you want to go.
Well, no, I think things sort of move around. I think what is important to find out what was good about the Middle Ages and about the past, and to learn from the past, and not to have not to live in this kind of cloud cuckoo land where we think everything is improving. And
well, you're not all that keen on progress, are you?
Well, I don't believe it's happening, that's the thing. I think we're kidding ourselves a lot of the time. And I think it's something like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. In a way, it looked convincing to us because it made the Middle Ages look so dirty, because it's kind of pandering to our kind of inflated view of how we're living now.
I like this clip from Terry Jones. The incredulity of Terry Wogan, who can't believe somebody who can see anything good in the medieval era. The fact that Terry Jones is wearing the most awful outfit possible, his obvious disdain for modern London, and all the while he had helped produce a film which made the medieval era look like it was filled with filthy, disease-ridden peasants. It's just a chef's kiss. But yes, I found the book. It is King Arthur's Avalon by Geoffrey Ashe, who was a very good historian. This book comes from the 1950s, and it's an excellent primer on the history of Glastonbury, Glastonbury Tor, Glastonbury Abbey, the kind of Celtic, pagan, Christian origins of the place, the possible connections to King Arthur. And he's talking in this chapter about the Anglo-Saxon engagement with Glastonbury. But then there's this sudden kind of break where he starts talking about the coming of the Norsemen to England and what they brought to the place and how that affects Glastonbury. And I want to read what he says here. It's a couple of paragraphs, a few paragraphs. And then the sky darkened, and all went down before a fresh onset of heathendom. The new marauders whom the North had held in reserve are described variously as Danes, Vikings, and Norsemen. The terms are not interchangeable, but they overlap enough to create confusion. In the English connection, Dane is the traditional word. From Scandinavia, at any rate, the marauders crossed over. Harmless peasant pioneers who had colonized the Shetlands and Orkneys were followed by warbands of buccaneering nobles, the armed spearheads of a gaudy, restless, rapacious society. These adventurers poured round Scotland into the Hebrides and Ireland, where they set up lawless principalities. Meanwhile, a more deadly horde swarmed over the North Sea directly into England. The British invasion was only part of a demonic outburst of energy. This is the first time he's used language like that. Demonic outburst of energy that lasted for several lifetimes and spread havoc in every quarter. Vikings terrorized Russia, Vikings besieged Paris, Vikings plundered the Mediterranean, but the English episode was the most frightful. Isolated raids gave place to a permanent, organized, and ever-expanding system of banditry. The Danish groups, which might have quarreled amongst themselves, coalesced into a single force, known to historians as the Great Army. While the army ravaged the land, the longships plied to and fro, reinforcing it, and darted unchecked about the coast. Ordinary narrative prose cannot convey the atmosphere of that time. It has been done in poetry. I'm thinking of Chesterton's Ballad of the White Horse, and perhaps the theme is best left to imaginative writers. An inhuman and implacable doom overhung the whole island. Trying to pierce the murk, we glimpse a kaleidoscope of horrors. Ships with devilish prows gliding up quiet estuaries, peasants violently dispossessed by enormous aliens who drank blood and dragged people through fires for sport, horses commandeered in their pasture and ridden madly over the farmlands, churches stripped, crosses cut down for firewood, laughter and learning suddenly struck dumb, refugees streaming one way and slaves streaming the other. The Danish zone in England was not a state, it was the absence of a state, and it spread like a satanic negation. As the 9th century wore its way along, Northumbria vanished from the map, Mercia followed, King Edmund of the East Angles died a martyr for the faith, London fell, and the Danes surged up the Thames towards Whitehorse Vale and the West Country. So, he's not very happy with the Danes, as one can see. I mean, it's kind of an outrageous depiction of the Norsemen, blood drinking demons. I don't know why he's so angry. It's interesting, seeing somebody dunk on the barbarian raiders so heavily. but I couldn't help but love it because there's a lot of Dane supremacy in our sphere. So I was kind of like, whoa, I love this guy. I want to read. I want to read this. Let's see what people have said. Lots of cope in the chat here from Vingle and JG. I see. Yes, that's true. They did set up laws. But I do like this kind of heathen surge, let's say. I think as well, part of why he's so against this is that he feels just before the Danish kind of Great Horde and so on, with Charlemagne and the kind of Anglo-Saxon courts in England, there was a beginnings of kind of real cultivation of civilization, and he's arguing that the kind of Viking attacks really nearly brought that to an end. Now, whether or not, I don't think he's right in saying that as such, that it's the Danish which are the problem. It's more the incoming of an invasion is what ends it, rather than a specific culture. Because as anyone who studied knows, like the Danes, the Norsemen have had a rich culture which brought us the poetic Edda in due course. Like that is culture, that is civilization. But yes, it's a fun quote. I may use it at the Witten in the future. But yes, anyway, and yes, he should be arrested for hate speech. I agree with you, JG. Right, I think it is time to call it a night. Thank you, everybody, for a lovely stream. And I hope that you have a good start to your week. I hope that it goes well if you're back to work, if you've already been back to work. And I shall catch up with you in the future. For the time being, God bless you all, whoever you are, wherever you are. Good night for now. Good night.